Regarding identity and identity crisis in the global community, let's talk a little bit about women and women's rights. Dr. Cruz, women making up, well, around half the population, but yet struggles. This segment of the population struggles, it seems to me, more than the male population, in the sense that much of what we talk about in the global community, whether it's health concerns, environmental concerns, refugees, those who are civilians and non-combatants that are, damaged in war, and poverty and development, and all of these things have a very significant impact on women, disproportionately on women. And so why is that? What is the concern about the impact of these things on women, and how can we address it?
Well, we do know, and the United Nations and various conventions has confirmed and verified that women and children are often the most adversely affected by conflict and natural disaster. If we think about conflict, we can think about the fact that most often men are the ones that are fighting in the conflict, and women and children who are at home are then having to take care of the everyday necessities and those sorts of things. So they are affected quite differently. They can also then be victims of rape, of other forms of violence. If they are refugees, again, they are naturally targets. If we think about the developing world, women are often, whether it's in a conflict area or not, they're the ones that have to feed the family, take care of the home, go and collect water to try to find clean water. A lot of waterborne illnesses that women seem to contract at a much higher rate than men. So they're often in a situation where they are more susceptible to some of these issues that you mentioned. And the good news here is that we have seen a lot more discussion of this. I'd say in the last 30 or so years, a number of organizations have been created, a number of conventions have been held, and people are talking about these issues in a much different way than they did in the past.
Particularly education, women's access to education. I think one of the things research really tells us is that if you educate girls, they are much more likely to educate their children. Mm-hmm. They are much more likely to provide for themselves, to gain employment, obviously, to provide a living, to make a living. And so educating girls is clearly a fabulous method that's been shown in terms of the research to pull women out of poverty. But health issues still remain a concern. I mean, there are still far too many women around the world that die from childbirth, for example, or that have consequences as a result of childbirth, injuries that they then have to live with, and it leads to all kinds of other consequences. I'm thinking of fistulas in many parts of the world, a very common injury after childbirth. So, there's much progress that's been made, more awareness being made about education among girls and women, but still concerns about health. And I might even mention about employment. I mean, women still suffer a significant amount of discrimination in the workplace around the world, and that's all parts of the world. Discrimination in the workplace, divergence in pay, that, if we want to call it that glass ceiling of being able to achieve higher levels of employment and higher rates of pay. But, as you mentioned, conferences on this, people talking about it, it's definitely out in the forefront now. Advocacy organizations popping up to help address issues of women's rights. What other kind of solutions do we have on this issue?
Well, something that's been really interesting is the framing of the issue. When early organizations got together, they talked about women's rights as a human rights issue, which it most certainly is. But when they didn't get a lot of play with that. And when they started reframing the issue to look at it as an economics issue, as you mentioned, if women are educated, if they're working, they're making money, they're supporting the economy, they're helping their children and providing and creating a better community. So if we look at it from an economic standpoint and get away a little bit from this human rights standpoint, then we have found that there are more supporters. So that's been a pretty successful tactic. The other thing I would say is you mentioned the conferences is getting women into politics. We know from various studies that at 30% of parliament, if you have women in 30% of parliament, that laws change, that new things are considered. And so there's been a real effort in this country and elsewhere, and it's been to varied success, to get women into parliament because they can change the dialogue and can change the discussion. In this country, for example, if you think about the fact that the number one killer health concern for women is heart disease. 30 years ago, people weren't really talking about female heart disease because the signs of heart disease in women are much different than the signs in men. Scientists were not paying attention to that. Politicians were not paying attention to that. You get women into the political process, you get them into the economic system, they start paying attention. So there were positive things that have come out of that. But as you mentioned again, there's a long ways to go in this country and certainly in other countries as well.
So, like you said, much has been done. Still more work to be done. Students, what do you think about women's rights? Is this something that we should focus on? Should the global community be concerned about women's rights? And how would you go about addressing them?